And here we go. Welcome, everyone, to our fourth and final week of Advent, the series of dialogues between me, Mike Morrell, and our esteemed guest, Alexander John Shaia, author of Heart and Mind, the Four Gospel Journey to Radical Transformation, who's been guiding us on a most singular Advent journey. Welcome, Alexander.
Good day to everyone across the world on this December the 24th, and perhaps even people down under who've already tipped over into Christmas.
Exactly. Yeah. It's all coming together now, isn't it?
It is. I like to remember that in the ancient calendar, this day, December the 24th, used to be the Feast of Adam and Eve. And it was in the Celtic cycle that on this day, the 24th of December, that people went out and decorated their quote unquote Christmas tree. And it was the realization that in the presence of Jesus the Christ, we are readmitted to the garden.
Wow.
And we can come again to that great tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and now enjoy it in the wonderment of the presence of Christ. And I feel sort of sad that this feast day of Adam and Eve got taken out of the calendar.
That's very sad because, we modern, especially Protestants, think we're still locked out of the garden. So yeah. That's a very different telling.
Yeah.
Well, so in this, fourth and final week, the Advent reading for this week centers around Mary's Magnificat, her beautiful prayer that she prays in the presence of Elizabeth as Elizabeth, her own son, leaps in her womb at the knowledge of this great and coming Emmanuel. So we thought we would get started by reading this extraordinary prayer together as rendered by Alexander, and he'll say it more in a moment about the uniqueness of this rendering. But here we are. This is Mary's Magnificat. My soul magnifies the Most High, and my spirit rejoices in you, my Savior. For you look with favor on the lowliness of your servant. Surely from now on, all generations will call me blessed, for the Mighty One has done great things for me, and holy is your name. Your mercy is for all who are in awe of you, from generation to generation. For you have shown strength with your arm, have scattered the proud in the thoughts of their hearts, have brought down the powerful from their thrones, and lifted up the lowly, have filled the hungry with good things, and sent the rich away empty, have helped your servant Israel in remembrance of your mercy, according to the promise you have made to our ancestors, to Abraham and Sarah and their descendants forever.
As I hold this prayer, Mike, I think of it as one of the most remarkable prayers in all the scripture and in all the gospels. And I know that we, in our tradition, often think of the Our Father or even think of the Beatitudes. But for me, this is so rare because Luke has opened his text by telling us about how difficult these days are, that the emperor and the governors and the priests in the temple are all against the people. And that in this moment, no one could think that there could be a turnaround or a change. And it's in this moment of depth, and we might even say agony and extremis, that he gives us Mary's prayer, that Mary is praying this prayer in those days. And you notice what she has done in the prayer, which she has prayed the future as if it's already happened. That she has already claimed and is living in the reality that God has already done these things, that God has fed those who have little, that God has brought down the haughty from their thrones, et cetera, et cetera. And it just, because Luke's text is about the road of service, and that for us in this day, culturally, politically, church-wise, many of us may feel like we're up against the stone that won't move. And Mary is giving us the prayer and the practice. That the prayer and the practice is listen deeply to God's promise, to know that promise, and then to go out every day and pick up the small work that God has given you to do, knowing that your work is not securing the victory. That's God's work. And knowing that the victory is already promised if each of us will but do the small things that God has given us to do. I just find it the most remarkable text of it's beyond hope, because there's an assurity that she has in her heart that she knows God's promise. She doesn't know when it will be fulfilled, and she doesn't know how it will be fulfilled, but she knows it will be fulfilled. She knows there will be new radiance. She knows that politically and civilly and spiritually and every other way, things will turn around.
Hmm.
And her work is to do the small portions that God has put on her heart.
I think it's important that you say that it's beyond hope, because I feel like right now, with all the things that are going on in our country and around the world, just, I won't get too specific in case you're watching this video later. It might be old news by then, but just, massive national instability going on, and never mind what might be happening in our own communities and our own families and our own lives. And oftentimes we're told, take heart, have hope. But what you're talking about and how you're interpreting this text is a bit different than simply hope. Can you say more about that?
Well, I am, and as you look at the spiritual journey, which I'm describing, has got these four parts to it. That in the first and the second part of the journey, hope is a developmental virtue. It's an important part of the journey, but as we move into the third part, which is the new knowing that comes from God, and the fourth part, which is the service, we're actually asked to move beyond hope to the sense that we know and trust God's promise. So it's a slightly different, it's like the hope is not that God's promise will be true, but it's the knowing that God's promise is true. And therefore, we can go about our work with less anxiety. We're not anxious or doubting that there will be a turnaround. We know in some place in us that God is here, God is with us, that in many ways we've been born to do the work of this moment. And Mary is like the prayer of the happy warrior who can pick up what God has put in her heart to do and inspire all of us to do the small portions that we've been given to do, knowing that all these small portions will be a lot like feeding the 5,000. God takes each of us giving our small portion and multiplies it into a magnificent new turnaround for the human family.
I like that. And can you say more about where that comes from? Because first, let me read a little portion of the written reflection that you accompanied today's video dialogue with. You say here, the tense. So when we read the Magnificat today, it was rendered in the present tense, and you say the tense plays an enormous significance in Mary's canticle. Have you ever noticed that Mary prays future actions of the Most High as if they had already taken place? In psychology, we might term this as a person having a positive outlook on the future. However, I see more than mere positive psychology at work here. As Elizabeth states, blessed is she who believes the fulfillment will happen. Note that the word Elizabeth uses is believes. Belief is a step beyond hope, and Mary goes beyond hope in this canticle. she proclaims that the Most High's promise is she proclaims this Most High's promise as something that has already happened. What you're sharing here kind of reminds me of how in the Quaker tradition, they don't talk about conversion. They talk about convincement, like I've been convinced. There's like a knowing that I know that I know. And at the same time, for many of us who I think have deconstructed our faith and are on reconstructing journeys, the idea of just believe it sounds similar to just hope. It feels like, oh man, that was what I was told in the past, and that really left me burned. I believed, and there was nothing on the other side of that belief. Maybe particularly if someone comes from a Pentecostal or charismatic background, it might sound like the kind of name it, claim it, speak it forth as though it's already true. And what's interesting about that is I think that the reason why those particular movements are among the fastest growing in the world today is it really does work for some people. Like they really do seem to see results from that. But then there's also this massive wreckage of folks for whom that doesn't hold true. And so I'm wondering if you could speak to that and how, if in any way, what you're describing here is different than that.
Well, let's go back to the example of Mary and remember what's happened already before she prays this beautiful canticle. She has already said yes to Gabriel, and she understands that now she can feel the growing new life in her. And she has heard this promise about that this new life in her is going to be part of the salvation of the people of Israel. So she doesn't know how any of this is going to happen day to day. She doesn't know exactly what she's going to be called to do day to day. What she knows is that she has heard God's promise that if she patiently takes up the spiritual practice day to day, that God will take care of the rest. And so this is not simply I believe at one moment and go about my life. It is a belief that God is giving me small spiritual works to do every day, which I have some commitment, or I like the word that you use from the Quakers, conviction. And that I know that ultimately this is God's work. It's beyond any one human person or any collection of human people to bring about a turnaround. That we are the vessels of something which is pulsing within us. And it's that paradox of I think the great prayer that we have to pray as if everything depended on God, and we have to work in some ways that it depends on us, in that paradox.
Yes. So if I'm hearing you, you're saying this particular belief of Mary's, this particular convincement, comes out of the context of this ongoing relationship with the divine, something that has been cultivated and is established. It's not simply wishful thinking, and that it's something that she then actively says, not in this particular passage, but be it unto me according to your word, that there is this sort of active receptivity and willingness to put this belief, to put this convincement into practice.
Yes. And that the convincement allows her to move into chaotic days with some sense of equanimity.
Hmm.
And I think it's often when we think of Nelson Mandela or we think of Martin Luther King, and I always, Hildegard, the great ones in our tradition who lived at a time where in the outer world there was great oppression. And yet they had an inner sense of knowing that God was there, which allowed them to do works with equanimity.
Mm.
And I think that it's often the great ones who can be about this enormous work with a sense of peace that we most are affected by, that we're most drawn to. And that in in the face of ecological disaster, in the face of financial downturn, in the face of political upheaval, these are all huge chaos events that we're living amidst. And yet, if we can live in the midst of them, not naively, but with equanimity and our eyes open and
Hmm.
love, that there's something about the small pieces of bread of love and equanimity amidst times of great chaos that feed the 5,000.
Yeah, yeah. What you're speaking of really speaks to an observation I've made in several decades of being a friend of God and an aspiring follower of Jesus, and it's that the very pressures and trials and heartbreaks that for some completely turns them off of faith. And they're just like, "Whoa, peace out, I'm gone," are some of the very same incidents that strengthen others' faith. And it sounds like it's not necessarily about being more virtuous per se, but maybe that repeated practice of courage in the face of these adversities, and that a certain tenacity and resilience. And it's not like I don't know. Sometimes I feel like I hear reductionist, materialist, atheist types being like, "Come on, Occam's razor. You would just have a better life if you got rid of all this God nonsense or the spirituality nonsense." But for those who do believe, and that belief becomes a practice born out of this conviction that something is really going on, from a psychological perspective, even that's an asset, right? That's not a
Right,
liability.
right. I'm often reminded of the example of Desmond Tutu in on the days, the most painful days in South Africa, where with his beautiful smile and his light heart, he would look at the soldiers that were opposing, quote unquote, opposing him, and invite them to join him because he said in their heart, they knew the truth and they knew the truth would win.
So this might very well be a Kierkegaardian leap of faith, but there's some solid ground on the other side of that leap.
Yeah,
Hmm.
yeah.
Well, this is a
And I,
go ahead. Go ahead.
yeah, well, and I also want to say, I'm not, this has been a really painful Advent for me.
Really?
And I mean, in the outer world, I've got this beautiful house that I share when I'm here in Santa Fe, and I have friends, and there's a tree, and there's presents. But in the inner realm, this has been a really, really painful Advent, and I have felt on edge. I have not felt the usual sense of contentment and even sort of quiet joy that I often feel in December.
Wow.
And so I have come back to Mary's prayer as an anchor. And there's and I'm praying for her conviction. I know that her conviction is a truth. I know that it's not every moment that I feel it. And it's largely escaped me this December. But even though that it's escaped me this December doesn't mean that it's not true. It's
Mm.
just in this moment, I have to go deeper inside of myself and pray for the grace of such a conviction.
Thank you for being vulnerable and for sharing that. I think that sometimes we can look to our teachers and our elders especially and think, well, Alexander's got it all figured out.
Thank you. I could only hope that. I use hope there intentionally.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh, so one of the things that we might talk about, Mike, is from those Christian traditions that have a 3-year cycle of reading the Gospels. They have a particular way of telling the Christmas story that I find very enlivening for myself. That the Christmas story is told as a present moment journey through nighttime to dawn and full day. And so if you were part of those traditions, depending on what time you would go to church, you would hear a different gospel text. And that gospel text is paired to the nighttime, to the deep nighttime, to the dawn, and to the day.
Wow.
And so the four gospels of Christmas form a journey about here and now. And it starts with those who might go to church at sunset, just as nighttime falls. And the first gospel of Christmas is Matthew's genealogy. And it doesn't have any of the story of the birth of Jesus in it, but it is that gripping genealogy about all of these people, all of these generations who had nighttime events fall on their lives, personal lives or collective lives. They were in chaotic times, and that they moved into that nighttime with a conviction that God was with them. So that's the first gospel of Christmas. And then for people, if you would go to church later in the night, the gospel would be from Luke, and it's the text of the angel announcing to the shepherd that a birth has happened. And then if you read the text closely, you know that once the angel announces the birth, then there's a host of angels that sing the great Hosanna. But here again, it is in the nighttime, the shepherds in the nighttime hear that there is a birth, and they believe. And so this is the second gospel of Christmas, is that wherever we find ourselves in a nighttime in our life, not just a nighttime after the sun goes down, but these texts is about what we do in the nighttime of our lives, culturally and personally. Listen for that inner angel voice. Listen for that inner wisdom voice that brings us back to the conviction there is a birth. This nighttime is about a birthing time. And then for those who would go through the nighttime and who might choose to go to church in the early hours of dawn, first light, they would hear the third gospel passage of Christmas. And this is the gospel passage of the shepherds coming to the manger and seeing that the birth is true. And this coming to the manger and seeing the birth is true is paired with the sun rising up across the horizon. And so again, the story of sunset, deep night, and dawn is the cosmos telling us about the inner journey that we make, not usually in the 24-hour period. It's a much longer period in our personal lives, but that we have some assurity of new radiance if we can move through the nighttime, believing in the consistency of the promise.
Yeah.
And then the fourth and final gospel of Christmas, probably one that very few of us go to church to hear, is the gospel that would be proclaimed at church in full daylight. So, maybe 8 or 9 o'clock in the morning and later. And this is the prologue of John, because the prologue of John brings us away from history, that the power of the Christmas story is not that Jesus was born in one moment in time. The power of the Christmas story is that Jesus is born in every moment of time. That the Christ has always been. The Christ didn't begin when Jesus was born. The Christ has always been, and the Christ is always going to be. And the reality is, are you going to participate in the Christ birthing in you now? So the last great story of Christmas is not the story of Bethlehem, but it's the story of here, now, today, your life and your heart and your action.
Wow. That sounds like there's so much forethought and intelligence that goes into the way that this is structured, which I think has been the theme of your life's work, that there was this sort of innate intentionality in these early rhythms of the church that we might nowadays think, oh, well, back then they were even more primitive, more fundamentalist, more what have you, and your conviction and your entire Quadratus message is no, there's a very skillful way to use these gospel texts, to utilize them to do what Rob Bell likes to say. It's not so much that they happened as it is that they happened.
Yes,
and they're happening within us.
Exactly. And that the early Christianity was absolutely eco-spiritual. Absolutely eco-spiritual.
Oh, say more about that.
Well, I mean, that they're not just choosing to tell the Jesus story out of the Bible, they're pairing the story to what's going on in the cosmos. They understood that you want to hear the story, the Christmas story of the angel and the shepherds in the night. Perhaps also it may be cold, but definitely in the nighttime. It's a nighttime text because there's something about nighttime which is present moment in us, and it reminds us of the night times of our life. And you want to hear the story of the shepherds coming to the manger and seeing, just as first light comes up across the horizon, then the sky turns purple and pink, and then that very light blue, because that reality that our bodies touch as we feel the first rays of warmth and we see the new radiance of the day reminds us of the same reality, that we too are the shepherds who have gone through the night and believe we will come and see the birth in our lives again and again, et cetera, et cetera. So that the eco reality was the reason for the text being told at that hour of night and day.
Right. They were not ignorant of the times and the seasons.
No.
Very, very intentional. And
and I know that for my friends down in the Southern Hemisphere who are really struggling because the cycle is opposite. And yet what I always say to them is, you can always use the 24-hour cycle of sunset, night, dawn, and full day. That you don't have to have the coldness along with it.
Yes, yeah. Unless you're at one of the poles, then that will work nicely. Yeah. Well, with that fourth gospel reading with John's prologue, it reminds me of something that I just have to share here. It's one of my favorite reflections from Meister Eckhart, who was this 13th century Dominican mystic and preacher. And in his own community in the Rhineland, in response to their own challenges, he asked three provocative questions. He said, "What is my name? What is your name? What is God's name?" And in answer to his own questions, he says, "Our name is that we must be born. The Creator's name is to bear. The soul alone among all creation is generative like God is. We are all meant to be mothers of God. What good is it for me that Christ was born 1,000 years ago in Bethlehem if he is not born today in our own time?"
Amen. Alleluia.
Yeah. That this is the advent of us in a lot of ways. That yes, we are waiting on God, and we are the ones that we are waiting for, because God moves within and through us.
And I have a small practice. I talk about it in this little film that the Work of the People has done with me about the nativity scene. And I will start out tonight, tomorrow, in the manger will be an image of the baby Jesus. But on the second day of Christmas, I'll take the baby Jesus out of that manger and I'll begin to write the spiritual practices, the spiritual exercises, the qualities, the virtues, the things that I want to work in myself to make that birth in me deeper and wider. So I don't adore a baby Jesus statue. I bring that reality of the manger home to my life.
Mm.
What is it in me through Advent and now moving into Christmas? What is the spiritual work that I want to assume for this coming new year?
Absolutely, and that echoes the invitation that you gave to us in your written reflection today. How may we take on the level of service needed in today's world? As we come to a close this Advent, Luke gives us great vigor here. Ponder Mary's canticle. Pray for our needs for mercy and justice today as having already happened. Notice the grace and inner strength that grow within you from this practice.
Amen.
Love it. Well,
Yeah,
thank
and
you.
I don't. It's not an easy practice. Don't feel, but it could. But if taken as a consistent practice in my life, I know the grace of it, and I wish, and that's my Christmas wish for everyone.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, mine too. This is a challenging time for many of us, and we're all in this together. So thank you, Alexander, for joining us for this Advent season. And thank all of you who have been part of this amazing online community with Make Advent Great Again. We're looking forward to further ways of being in touch. You'll be hearing from Alexander soon via email, and from me, and from Tripp and I. So looking forward to continuing this adventure together.
Great blessings, Michael, and to everyone. Merry Christmas.
Mm-hmm.